45 people on board. The plane crashes into the heart of the Andes. Within days, rescue teams stop searching. Everyone is declared dead. But among the wreckage, at 3,600 meters above sea level, 16 people keep fighting. And among them is a young man named Nando Parrado, who will do the impossible to save the others. Before we continue, I'd appreciate your subscription. Now let's return to the story. October 13th, 1972. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 prepares for takeoff from Carrasco International Airport in Montevideo. On board are 45 people, the Old Christians rugby team, their friends, relatives, and the flight crew. For them, it's supposed to be just another trip. A quick flight over the Andes, a match in Santiago, and a weekend full of excitement. Nando Parrado sits by the window, listening to his teammates argue about tactics for the upcoming game. Some passengers joke, others pass around snacks, and a few take photos. Snapshots that will soon become chilling reminders of the last carefree moments of their lives. The aircraft, a Fairchild FH227D, lifts off the runway with a familiar vibration. Passengers applaud, laugh, settle into their seats. Outside the windows, the Andes begin to rise, a jagged, endless wall of ice and rock. Few on board understand how unforgiving these mountains are. Fewer still realize how close the flight path runs to their towering peaks. Around 3 p.m., the first signs of trouble appear. A sudden jolt, a shiver of turbulence that silences the cabin for a few seconds. Someone jokes, "The Andes are welcoming us." But Nando notices one of the flight attendants gripping a seat back a little too tightly. She knows what most of the passengers don't. The weather is changing fast. As the aircraft approaches the border between Argentina and Chile, it enters a dense wall of cloud. Visibility drops to zero. Outside, there are no more mountains, no horizon, only a white, suffocating void. Inside the cockpit, the pilots fight to maintain their bearings. Strong crosswinds batter the aircraft. Instruments become harder to trust. The Fairchild is now drifting dozens of miles off course. Most passengers remain unaware. They continue talking, laughing, trading predictions for the match. But Nando looks out the window and feels something unsettling. The mountains have disappeared. There is nothing but swirling fog and darkness. At 3:34 p.m., the error becomes fatal. The aircraft, still blind inside the cloud layer, is descending, believing it has already passed the highest peaks. It hasn't. Ahead, hidden in the mist, rises a ridge more than 4,000 meters high. Flight 571 was supposed to land in Santiago, supposed to end with hotel rooms, dinner plans, and stories shared over drinks. But on October 13th, 1972, just minutes from the impact, no one on board realizes how quickly their world is about to end. Only a few moments remain before the mountains tear the aircraft apart and change the lives of everyone on board forever. At 3:34 p.m., Flight 571 was still flying blind inside a wall of cloud. No one in the cabin could see what lay ahead, a ridge of solid rock hidden in the mist. The pilots, believing they had already crossed the highest peaks of the Andes, began to descend. They were wrong by dozens of miles. The first impact came like an explosion. The aircraft scraped the side of a mountain, tearing off part of the wing instantly. A blast of freezing air and snow filled the cabin. Passengers were thrown around like rag dolls. Some screamed. Others didn't have time to react. Then came the second hit, even worse. The nose of the plane crumpled as if it were made of cardboard. Rows of seats ripped loose from the floor. Several passengers were ejected through the torn fuselage and disappeared into the blinding white void outside. Others clung to whatever they could as the aircraft broke apart beneath them. The fuselage didn't stop immediately. It kept sliding down the mountainside for hundreds of meters, grinding against rock and ice. Metal screeched. Snow burst through every opening. Parts of the plane peeled away like layers of foil. And then, suddenly, silence. A heavy, unnatural silence. The kind that feels almost dead. Nando Parrado lay motionless. The force of the crash had thrown him across several rows, leaving him disoriented and barely conscious. His ears rang. His vision swirled. For a moment, he didn't know if he was alive or dying. Around him, chaos. Cries of pain. Shouts for help. Broken breathing. And bodies that no longer moved. Some passengers were pinned under seats. Some were half buried in snow. Some were mangled in ways no one could help. There were shattered limbs, crushed chests, torn clothing. The cold made everything worse. Blood froze as it touched the metal floor. The survivors, still in shock, began to dig each other out with bare hands. They dragged people from under twisted aluminum, tried to stop bleeding with scraps of fabric, called the names of friends who didn't answer. Just hours earlier, they were laughing together. Now they were surrounded by the dead. The temperature kept dropping. The wind sliced through the torn fuselage. There was no food, no heat, no rescue. Only the reality of survival, and the terrible knowledge that many of their closest friends and family were already gone. Nando, slipping in and out of consciousness, didn't yet know whether his sister had survived, which teammates were still alive, or how many hours he himself had left. And he had no idea that what happened today was only the beginning, not the end. After the impact, time seemed suspended. The fuselage lay broken on a frozen slope in the Andes, surrounded by nothing but endless white ridges stretching in every direction. It was around 4 p.m., October 13, 1972. The temperature was already dropping toward -20 to -30 degrees Celsius. Inside the wreck, chaos ruled. Those who could still move crawled between the injured, trying to help. Those who couldn't move lay in silence, shivering, bleeding, slipping in and out of consciousness. Some moaned weakly, their voices barely audible over the wind. Others didn't make a sound at all. In the first hours, the survivors tried to understand who was alive, who was missing, and who had died. Some passengers had been thrown from the plane during the slide and were nowhere to be found. Others had died instantly. 5 more died within hours from injuries and exposure. Nando Parrado, who had been unconscious since the crash, finally opened his eyes. His skull was fractured, his memory fragmented, and he couldn't recall the crash at all. The first face he saw was Roberto Canessa leaning over him, checking his pulse. "You're alive, Nando. You survived," he whispered. But Nando's first question was about his sister, Susanna. She lay nearby, alive but severely injured, barely conscious. Night fell violently and suddenly like a door slamming shut. The cold became predatory, creeping under clothes, biting through skin, squeezing lungs with every breath. There were no blankets, no heaters, no way to warm even a single hand. The survivors huddled together for warmth, bodies pressed against bodies just to stay alive. Oh, by morning, 3 more had died. Food was almost non-existent. They gathered everything they could find in the wreck. A few chocolate bars, some bottles of wine, a bit of jam. For 27 people, and only for a few days. Nando couldn't eat due to his head injury. Others forced themselves to take tiny bites, trying to trick their stomachs into believing it was enough. Then came the moment that shattered whatever hope remained. On the third day, one of the boys managed to tune a small transistor radio. Everyone crowded around, expecting to hear encouraging news, that search teams were still looking, that planes were sweeping the mountains, that help was on the way. Instead, they heard, "Search efforts for Flight 571 have been officially terminated. All passengers are presumed dead." For several seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. Then the reactions began. One dropped to his knees. Another covered his face and sobbed. Someone screamed in disbelief. Many simply stared into the snow in blank, silent shock. That announcement didn't just break their spirit. It destroyed it. The survivors understood the truth. No one was coming. The Andes had become their prison. Food was nearly gone. Cold claimed new victims every day. And ahead of them lay the darkest decision they would ever face. A decision they still refused to speak about aloud. The date was October 23rd, 1972. Cold had become routine, hunger constant, and exhaustion a part of every breath. The survivors had learned to exist inside the broken fuselage, their shelter, their hospital, and their tomb. That evening, the weather worsened. The wind slammed against the metal walls so violently that it felt like the plane was moving again, not through the sky, but along the edge of death. The group lay huddled together, pressed body to body, trying to trap whatever warmth remained. Around 8 p.m. it happened. At first, a faint cracking sound, so quiet that no one reacted. Then a heavy, distant rumble, and within seconds, the mountain struck. An avalanche. It tore down the slope with the force of a collapsing building and hit the fuselage like a battering ram. Snow exploded inside, swallowing the survivors in an instant. Some didn't even gasp. They were pinned under tons of ice before they had time to scream. Total darkness. Pure chaos. And the sound of people suffocating. The avalanche filled every opening, every gap, every breath of space. Hands clawed blindly. Voices faded under the crushing weight. Nando Parrado woke to the feeling of his face buried in snow. He tried to push it away. His arms wouldn't move. He tried again. Nothing. Panic surged as the air thinned. He had survived a plane crash, only to die under a mountain of snow. Nearby, Roberto Canessa screamed for help, but the snow muffled everything. Dozens of bodies were trapped, some completely entombed. Others could move only their fingers. Temperatures plummeted toward minus 30 degrees Celsius, and every second without air tightened death's grip. Those on the top layer, those not buried, began to dig. Hands bled. Knuckles split. They dug with elbows, fists, anything that could move. Every handful of snow meant one more second of life for someone beneath them. When the avalanche finally settled, an eerie silence filled the fuselage. Then came the counting. 8 people were dead. Only 19 remained. Many who had survived the crash, survived the impact, the cold, the starvation, died now, in minutes, trapped under the snow. For the survivors, it was an unbearable blow. They were already at the limit of human endurance. And now the mountain had taken more of them. That night, Nando Parrado sat in the darkness, shaking, trying to understand why they were still alive and why others weren't. They had already survived the impossible, the crash, the freezing nights, the hunger, but the Andes had claimed them again. And everyone inside the fuselage understood. If the mountain wanted more, it would take more. The days after the avalanche were darker than anything that had come before. The fuselage was smaller now, colder, emptier. Only 19 survivors remained, and all of them knew that this number could fall again at any moment. Their food supply had vanished completely. The last crumbs of chocolate, a few remaining sips of wine, gone. Hunger was no longer a sensation. It was a violent, twisting pain that woke them in the middle of the night. Their bodies grew weaker with every hour. Their lips cracked from the cold. Their voices broke when they tried to speak, and their movements slowed to the pace of the dying. Hope had vanished days earlier, on the third day, when they heard the radio broadcast announcing that the search for Flight 571 had been officially terminated. But after the avalanche, whatever remained of their faith collapsed entirely. No one was coming. No planes were flying these mountains. No rescue teams were searching anymore. The world believed they were dead. And so, in that silence, a thought began to appear. At first whispered, then feared, then impossible to ignore. A thought no one wanted to voice, but everyone felt. They stared at the bodies of their friends, preserved perfectly by the cold, and understood the truth none of them wanted to face. Without food, they would die. All of them. Not in weeks, within days. Someone recalled stories of shipwrecked sailors forced to take unthinkable measures to survive. Someone mentioned that the church had long ago debated such cases. Others simply lowered their eyes, unable to speak. This was not a choice between right and wrong. It was a choice between life and death. Between returning home or dying slowly next to the people they loved most. For Nando Parrado, the moment was even heavier. His sister Susana had succumbed to her injuries after the crash, and her body now lay cold in the snow outside. He knew her. He knew what she would tell him if she were alive. Live. Do whatever it takes to live. He didn't choose this fate. None of them did. But the mountain had forced them into a corner where morality and survival no longer lived in the same world. That night, the survivors understood that without making the hardest decision of their lives, none of them would see another sunrise. And as devastating as it was, they knew the truth. The worst was still ahead. When all food was gone and the survivors had already made the hardest moral decision of their lives, one truth became unavoidable. Staying inside the fuselage meant dying. Days passed, but strength faded. The cold gnawed at their bones, the thin air drained their lungs, and the bodies of the living grew so light, it seemed the mountain itself was hollowing them out. Some could barely stand. Others couldn't stand at all. The fuselage had become a place where time didn't move forward, only downward. That was when the only possible idea appeared. Someone would have to cross the Andes on foot. The thought was insane. Climbing 4,000-meter peaks with no gear, no proper clothes, and almost no boots was something even trained mountaineers would hesitate to attempt. But there was no alternative. Below them were cliffs and glaciers. Around them, death and starvation. And above them, the only direction hope still existed. Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa volunteered. Nando couldn't sit and watch his friends die one by one. Canessa, physically strong and mentally focused, understood the grim mathematics of their situation. Even the smallest chance was better than none. They began to prepare. They turned scraps of aluminum into makeshift snowshoes. They used seat cushions to create crude backpacks. They wrapped fabric and insulation around their feet, because their shoes were falling apart. From the clothing of the dead, they stitched together a kind of sleeping bag, primitive, heavy, but warm enough to survive a night above the clouds. When they finally stepped out of the fuselage, they felt as if they were moving. In reality, their steps were painfully slow, each one a small battle. Every ascent forced them to stop to catch their breath, their lungs burning from the thin air. Sometimes their vision blurred and the world tilted sideways. During the day, the sun burned their skin until it cracked. At night, the cold threatened to finish what the mountain had started. But nothing compared to the moment when they reached the top of the first major ridge. They had imagined that beyond it, they would see green valleys, forests, maybe even a path leading toward civilization. Instead, they saw mountains, endless mountains. A horizon made entirely of white peaks stacked against the sky. It looked as if the Andes were laughing at them, saying, "You haven't even begun." And yet they kept walking. Because each step, no matter how small, no matter how painful, was a step toward life. And without those steps, there would be no life at all. Several days in the mountains had turned into an endless struggle for every breath. Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa moved so slowly that time felt frozen. Every night they believed they would freeze to death. Every morning they wondered how their bodies had survived until dawn. They slept on bare rock, wrapped in a makeshift sleeping bag stitched from scraps of clothing, and awoke to the cold splitting their bones. Yet somehow, they kept going. Day after day, the landscape began to change. The snow thinned, the peaks lowered, the sky turned clearer. For anyone else, it would have meant hope. For them, it was just another test. Exhausted, lips torn and bleeding, faces burned raw by the sun, feet shredded under layers of cloth, they barely stayed upright. To avoid stopping, they forced themselves to speak, short, broken sentences, each word costing strength they didn't have. Sometimes they walked in silence for hours, because even talking might have slowed them down enough to collapse. On the fourth day of descent, they reached gentler slopes. There was no ice anymore, but their bodies were collapsing instead. Every step felt like the last one their legs could ever take. Nando fell repeatedly, lying motionless until Canessa pulled him up with what little strength he had left. Both understood. If one of them stopped for too long, the other would have to walk alone, and that would mean death for both. Near sunset, when the sky glowed orange behind the ridges, they saw the first real sign that their nightmare might end. A small stream flowing down from the mountains, and beside it, hoof prints. That could only mean one thing: people, civilization, life. The next morning, they followed the stream. They barely spoke, barely thought. They simply moved forward, driven not by strength, but by instinct. Another meter, another step, just keep walking. Hours passed. The sun grew hotter. Their vision blurred. Their legs shook uncontrollably. And then, when they expected nothing anymore, when the world around them dimmed and their bodies became little more than pain, they saw a figure. On the opposite side of a deep ravine stood a Chilean muleteer, a living human being. Real. Not a hallucination. Nando tried to shout, but only a rough whisper came out. Canessa raised his arms, waving what remained of his clothing. The muleteer froze at first. He thought he was looking at ghosts. But when the two boys collapsed onto the ground, he understood. This was no illusion. These were survivors. So it was the moment that changed everything. The first human they had seen in 70 days. The first real chance of rescue. The first time the Andes finally let them go. After encountering the muleteer, the final and most decisive phase of their rescue began. Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa could barely stand. The muleteer gave them water and a small amount of food. But the most important thing he offered was a promise. He would return. The gorge was too dangerous to cross immediately, so he signaled to other herders and prepared to make his way toward civilization. For Nando and Canessa, a new kind of waiting began, one that could lead either to salvation or to death. The next day, help arrived. Local herders returned and threw a note across the river. "I come from a plane that crashed. We have many injured. We need help." They gestured that they were going to fetch authorities. Those few handwritten words became the turning point for 16 lives. While the muleteers descended the valleys to alert the police and military, Nando and Canessa remained where they were. They were too weak to continue walking. But now, for the first time in over 2 months, someone knew they were alive. On December 19, 1972, the first rescue helicopter lifted off. The mission was extremely dangerous. Thin air, unpredictable winds, and harsh mountain conditions made flying risky. But the pilots knew that somewhere in those peaks were boys who had been fighting death for 70 days. The helicopter reached the crash site and evacuated the first group of survivors. The rest stayed behind for one more night, huddled together inside the broken fuselage, listening to the fading echo of the rotor blades, the most beautiful sound they had ever heard. The next morning, the second helicopter arrived. These were the final hours of their 72-day ordeal. When rescuers opened the fuselage door, many survivors couldn't speak. Some cried silently. Others laughed in disbelief. A few touched the metal of the helicopter, as if making sure it was real. Only Nando remained calm. He had used up every tear during those endless days crossing the Andes. In total, 16 people survived. Their story became one of the greatest survival sagas in human history. And each of them returned home with a truth they would carry forever. In those mountains, they were already dead, until they proved otherwise.